When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello my fellow goblins, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about how did the ending of Game of Thrones Season 8 impact George R.R. Martin's writing, and how it will change his ending. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps channel grow with your people that might like this content as well. And let's get into it. So let's kind of set the stage, right? So Game of Thrones Season 8. Already, at this point, it had already been an unnatural amount of time in between books, right? At this point, like, it definitely seemed like he was struggling to write Winds of Winter after Dance of the Dragons. He was kind of struggling. And I think what made this process even worse is that he had some things he wanted to do, right? So I think there are certain plot points that make a lot of sense that he wanted to do. Bran becoming king was a George R.R. Martin thing. Arya killing the Night King, very possible. I don't think it's likely, but maybe with some more development and building up her character, that can make a lot more sense in the book. But I think the way that these plots were concluded, and the way everyone reacted with everyone hating Bran becoming king, Arya killing the Night King, and a lot of the other plot points when you look at how characters ended, I think George had a very rough way of how he wanted to get there, and because of the way that this reaction happened, I think it's caused him to have a lot of indecision, where maybe he had things written to get to these points, and because of the negative impact of Game of Thrones, he decided to remake it, to make his ending much better and to try and change it. But the problem with that becomes, okay, George R.R. Martin was already struggling, and he's a very slow writer, as we've seen. Did that screw him up? Because now, all of these times, I mean, if you look at when Game of Thrones ended, right, we were already, I think, what, 8 years in to him writing it, and now he has to backtrack and change a bunch of things. Just look at it, put it this way, right? So Feast for Crows was supposed to be one massive book, basically, and it ended up getting split into 2, which caused Dance of the Dragons to be released a bit later than it probably would have if it had been just one book with Feast for Crows, because he had to rewrite plots, figure out what he wanted to be in each book, and it kind of delayed him a bit. Now take that on a grander scale, where he's basically trying to rewrite entire plots to how the book would end because of Game of Thrones. Now let's put that even aside as well, on the actual narrative part of how the show ended, right? Is because Game of Thrones was received so badly, because it ended so badly, and his story was concluded before he could conclude his own, does that dishearten him? Does he not even want to complete his own story now at this point? Because at this point, I mean, the legacy of Game of Thrones is tarnished. It is seen as the greatest failure of all time, right? And is George R. R. Martin, to a degree, scared that maybe his writing and his books will be the same? I think there's a small hint of that. I don't think he believes that. I think he knows if he completed it and took the time, it would be good. But not only has Game of Thrones impacted it in that regard, Game of Thrones has also has put a ton of more pressure on the books, because everybody is now saying, okay, well, we want to see the books even more now, because they won't be as bad as this. But then George R. R. Martin could be thinking in the back of his mind, well, some of these were plots that I had wanted to do, so how does that reflect me, right? And because Game of Thrones is now over, everyone is getting on George's case even more to complete the books, right? And even some of the blame of the later seasons gets shifted onto George because he didn't have the books released for the later seasons, which, again, I've talked about in the past. I don't think that had as much an effect as people think it did. I think more of the problem was D&D had fatigue of the show. They didn't really want to do the show anymore. They wanted to move on to other things. 2, if you look at Season 5, it was an adaptation of Book 4 and 5, and it was a very bad adaptation. So at that point, they were already not doing a great job of adapting material anyway. So I don't think it really would have helped that tremendously. Would it have been okay or better than what we got when they had to make their own story? Yes, probably. But you look at that idea and it's just put more pressure on George. And I think the success of Game of Thrones in the early seasons and even into the later ones like 5 and 6, it really took away from him wanting to complete the books, in my opinion. So if you look at the long-term effects of Game of Thrones and the issues with the ending, I would say it just delayed George R.R. Martin even more. I would say it destroyed him wanting to do something, or destroyed him wanting to finish the books, because his story had already been told. And yes, it wasn't his exact story, but what was on there as Game of Thrones, he was involved in the early season. I think it did set him back a little. It did kind of destroy his motivation to want to complete the series. And I think for me, if you look at it from like a YouTube point of view, right? If I had been working on a series of videos, like if you say, let's do it this way. I've been wanting to do a series very similar to how Order of the Green Hand or Alt-Shift-X went through and read the book and gave their perspective of the things that happen and their theories as they're reading the book and all that to you guys. And I've been wanting to do that. And it would be kind of like if I got through 4 out of 5. I got done with Feast for Crows and I was on a Dance with Dragons, and I started doing that and I stopped. And for some reason or another, somebody else completed the series for me, but it wasn't me doing it. It wasn't the way I would have done it. Like, certain ideas would have been different, right? Because they're a different person, they're a different interpretation of characters, right? Maybe they would have been a huge fan of Daenerys, so they would have had a lot more energy, a lot more intrigue in Daenerys, while I would have had a lot more of that towards maybe a character like Jon, right? So it's the whole idea here that I then, if Winds of Winter came out, would feel really weird continuing that series because I wouldn't have the motivation to really do it. It wouldn't be my series anymore, right? So that's kind of a way I will try to parallel how that would kind of feel, right? Where you've gone and you've worked so much into a journey to have the finish of that kind of be finished by somebody else. Or let me put it in a different light. If I was to go back and redo doing Dance of the Dragons, the problem would be, one, not as many people would care, right? Because they've already seen somebody else do it on the channel. And two, it's like it would feel really awkward to do because somebody's already done it. So that is kind of how I would draw that parallel. But getting back to it, I think Game of Thrones is probably the worst thing that ever could have happened to A Song of Ice and Fire being finished. In my personal regard, I think the best idea would have been, if we wanted the book to happen soon, is that Game of Thrones would have stopped releasing seasons until the books caught up. It would have forced George to do it. That would never have happened, though, just because of money. HBO wanted the money. They wanted the attention. And they'd already, if you think about it, right, Season 8, there was a 2-year gap in between Season 7 and Season 8. They gave George all the opportunities to finish it, and he just never did. So that's kind of the video. I know it was a little scattered and all that, but thank you guys for sticking with me, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.